Today is Bitcoin White Paper Day, the 16th anniversary of the publication of Bitcoin's founding document. Today is also Halloween, a day millions of children will dress up in costumes and pretend to be their favorite character. And perhaps appropriately today, we also have a new FakeToshi. This podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as financial advice. All views expressed on this podcast are solely the opinions of the host and/or any guests that we might have from time to time. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as a specific inducement to make a particular investment or to follow a particular investing strategy. Guten Tag, Buenos Dias, Morgen, and welcome to episode 186 of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. Real quick, I'd like to apologize for being a day late. I did spend the last 10 days or so on the road out west. Last night I returned from Albuquerque, New Mexico, but I didn't get home until well after midnight. Obviously too late to get this show out on time. I did, however, make my DCA Wednesday stack on time. I just couldn't find a quiet place to record a quick episode in the various airports and airplanes that I spent the day in. On a side note, I didn't meet a single Bitcoiner on the entire trip, at least not one that I knew was a Bitcoiner. I'm sure I passed many plebs out there in my journey, but nobody came up to me and introduced themselves as a Bitcoiner. And this is despite the fact I was wearing a Bitcoin hat on most of my journey. And I did reach out on social media on various accounts asking if there were any Bitcoiners in the area or any Bitcoin meetups in the area while I was there. So not to worry, that just goes to show that we are early. Had we gotten past the you are early stage, I would have expected to have been mobbed by Bitcoiners. Of course, in hyper-Bitcoinization, you would expect the majority of the shops and stores that I visit to be familiar with Bitcoin or to accept Bitcoin. And the fact that that is not the case just shows that we are early on this journey. As I mentioned, today is also Halloween, and here in the United States anyway, Halloween is not an official holiday, certainly not a government holiday. Halloween, of course, has its roots in an ancient Celtic festival dating back more than 2,000 years. Of course, during the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church took a lot of the pagan holidays and tried to Christianize them. And of course, as Christianity spread throughout Europe, the early Christian church attempted to eliminate those pagan traditions. In the 8th century, Pope Gregory III designated November 1st as a time to honor All Saints. This became known as All Saints' Day, and the evening before All Saints' Day became known as All Hallows' Eve, later shortened to Halloween. Halloween came to the United States when European immigrants, particularly Irish immigrants, brought their varied Halloween customs with them. Almost said costumes, Freudian slip. The potato famine in Ireland in 1846, of course, led to a massive influx of Irish immigrants to America, further popularizing their Halloween traditions. In modern times, Halloween is celebrated on October 31st, with people around the world donning costumes, trick-or-treating, and engaging in various festivities. Despite its Christian origins, Halloween has retained many of its ancient Celtic roots. I keep saying Celtic. That's because here in the United States, we have a basketball team in Boston called the Boston Celtics. Same spelling, it's just pronounced Celtics because a lot of words changed their pronunciation when they got adopted into American English. Anyway, Halloween retained many of its Celtic roots, including its emphasis on the supernatural and the blurring of boundaries between the living and the dead. As Bitcoiners know, today is also Bitcoin White Paper Day. This is the 16th anniversary of the day Satoshi Nakamoto published the Bitcoin White Paper. The White Paper is Bitcoin's founding document, formerly titled Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. It was written by Satoshi Nakamoto and published to a cryptography mailing list in 2008, outlining Bitcoin's core principles and technical specifications, being a decentralized, cryptographically secured, and trustless peer-to-peer electronic payment system. Of course, it was sent out to a cryptography mailing list a couple of months before Satoshi began running the Bitcoin protocol, and the first block, the Genesis block, was mined. I am going to try and keep today a tight rip, but there is a lot I do want to talk about, and of course, we will get into all of that in just a minute. But before I do, let's take a quick look at Bitcoin's vital statistics. Of course, I'm coming to you a day late. So currently, at the time of this recording, we are at a block height of 868,294, and Bitcoin is ringing in at 69,990 US dollars, or 1,429 sats per dollar. At the time I stacked, that was late last night, we were at a block height of block 868,188. Bitcoin was quite a bit more expensive. I purchased at $72,415. We'll get into that a little bit more later in the episode when we talk more specifically about that DCA Wednesday stack. At the time of this recording, Bitcoin has a market capitalization of 138 trillion. That's the second time I've made that Freudian slip. In my notes, there is distinctly a dot that says $1.38 trillion. Yesterday, when I did my stack, that was $1.43 trillion, which was certainly an impressive market capitalization. For those of you who value your wealth in shiny yellow rocks, it will currently cost you 25.3 ounces of gold to purchase just one Bitcoin. And for those of you who value your wealth in pizza, one Bitcoin will purchase you 3,914 large pepperoni pizzas from Papa John's. At the time I did my stack, that number was a whopping 4,409 large pepperoni pizzas from Papa John's, which worked out to a pizza every day for more than 11 years. That statistic that you know has been my favorite metric for the entirety of this podcast, Bitcoin's average transaction rate, 24-hour average transaction rate. It's down a bit. It's 5.93 transactions per second versus yesterday's absolutely screaming 8.2 transactions per second on average. And once again, that reflects that the higher transactions per second when the price was pumping, and then the significantly lower transaction per second now that the price is pulling back quite a bit. Again, correlation isn't causation. It's not any official metric, but in my observation in the entirety of the history of this podcast, when we've seen transactions per second increasing, that was corresponding to number go up. And then when transaction per second was waning a bit, the price was pulling back. Speaking of on-chain transactions, the mempools are still relatively full. Clark Moody's dashboard's mempool is showing 99,438 transactions in the mempool, and mempool.space is showing a whopping 181,960 transactions in their mempool. Along those lines, if you need to send an on-chain transaction, the fee estimator, well, it's not looking too shabby. Last night when I did my stack, it was kind of an anomaly. Clark Moody's dashboard was estimating that it would cost you 7 sats per VByte for a high priority transaction. But for whatever reason, mempool.space's fee estimator was showing that it was going to cost you an insane 734 sats per VByte, which worked out to $74.39. Even for a medium priority transaction, they were recommending a fee of 544 sats per VByte. And a no priority transaction, they were saying the minimum fee you should include was 298 sats per VByte. Things have certainly calmed down. I was actually on the move. Well, of course I was on the move. I was traveling 3/4 of the way across the United States. So I didn't look into it a whole lot. I did notice that it hadn't been very long since the last block came in, but I didn't scroll back and see if there were 1 or 2 blocks that had taken an hour or so in the immediate history that might have justified those insane or at least caused those insane fee recommendations. Obviously, that wasn't reflected in Clark Moody dashboard's fee estimator, and fees went right back to normal. Where they're sitting right now with Clark Moody recommending an immediate transaction of a fee of just 5 sats per VByte. And of course, mempool.space recommending just 4 sats per VByte for a high priority transaction. And that works out to just 30 cents in US dollars, obviously more than $74 cheaper than what they were recommending last night. Of course, they're saying a medium, low, or no priority transaction needs a fee of either 3 or 2 sats per VByte. While I was gone, I had issues with a hardware wallet, and it was a Ledger that I've had forever. It's my oldest device, and the screen went out, and I had been meaning to consolidate a bunch of sats that were on that device, and so that kind of threw the hat over the fence. And so I consolidated all the transactions, all the UTXOs that were on that Ledger to a different device, and I did so at a fee of just 2 sats per VByte, and it confirmed in the very next block. So fees are still cheap, even though they had that anomaly last night, if you are looking at consolidating UTXOs or you've got a really important on-chain transaction to make, now is as good a time as any, because when the price really starts ripping, it would be logical to assume that the fees to transact on chain are going to go through the roof as well. Even though last night was probably a fluke, we have seen in the previous Bitcoin halving inspired bull markets that fees have gotten quite expensive. Of course, in 2017, when Bitcoin said it's just under $20,000 all-time high, it was around $50 to make an on-chain transaction. That was before SegWit. So it's gotten cheaper in general because SegWit changed the data structure of a transaction as far as the fee accounting purposes goes. Obviously, that's what the spammers have used to take advantage to send virtually free, unlimited spam transactions. But the point being, a lot of things have changed since 2017, and I wouldn't anticipate in Satoshi terms for it to get as expensive as it did then, because when that was a $50 transaction fee in US dollar terms, it was significantly more in Satoshis because Bitcoin only topped out at $20,000. Bitcoin's more than triple that right now. So that would be a $150 transaction in today's terms if it was the same number of Satoshis. Unfortunately, we haven't seen anything like that, even with last night's insane fee recommendation of 734 sats per VByte. That's just another example of why it's important to do your homework before you send an on-chain transaction. Get an idea of what the fee estimates are, and realistically why the fee estimates are what they are. For example, a previous episode, we had a really high fee estimate, but that was because it had been like 40 minutes since the previous block, and we discussed that during that show. After the next block or two confirmed, fees drop back down to about 2 sats per VByte. So do your homework, know what you're doing. That goes with in general before you make any kind of Bitcoin transaction. Speaking of on-chain, we're getting a little bit closer to Bitcoin's next difficulty adjustment. As you know, Bitcoin's mining difficulty, that is the difficulty it takes to find the next block, is adjusted every 2016 blocks, which works out to about every 2 weeks, but that, just like the halving, varies depending on how fast or slow transactions are coming in. But if they did average 10 minutes between block, as the Bitcoin Core Protocol intends, as it aims for, that would work out to about 2 weeks. We are now about 600, we're exactly 602 blocks away from the next mining difficulty adjustment. So about 4 days from now, on November 4th, and depending where you get your data, this is going to be a relatively significant difficulty increase, anywhere between 8.2% and 8.59%. And that's because blocks have been cooking. Currently, blocks are averaging 9 minutes and 15 seconds per block during this difficulty epoch. And that is precisely because network hash rate is up. Currently, the estimated 90-day average is 659.3 exahash. That's up 1 whole exahash from just yesterday and up significantly from last DCA Wednesday. Real quick, I want to take a minute to thank those of you listening on your favorite Podcasting 2.0 apps, such as Fountain. Podcasting 2.0 allows you to support this podcast through the value for value method, allowing you to contribute value back to the podcast for the value that you feel you're receiving by listening. And you can do that in one of two ways, either by streaming sats on a minute per minute basis as you listen, kind of the set it or forget it method, where you say, I think listening to this podcast is worth 1 Satoshi per minute of my time, or 10 Satoshis per minute of my time. Totally up to you. You pick that number, you set it, and then you automatically stream sats to the podcast as you're listening. The second method, the most popular method, and my favorite method, is the boost method. And a boost is a shout out where you send a message to the podcast, letting me know what you think about the pod, maybe letting me know about something that's going on in your life or in the Bitcoin community in your area, or even just saying hello. You can really say whatever you want. But because it's a Lightning transaction, you're also sending value back to the podcast in the form of some Satoshis. Of course, we read our boosts on the next episode of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast, the episode following when we receive the boost. And we do have one boost to read, and that is from longtime supporter of the podcast, longtime listener Leggy. Leggy sends 3,000 sats and says, thanks for the episode. Only one more week until the final of Red versus Blue. Leggy is exactly right. I try and keep this. You might laugh when I say this, but I try my best to keep this podcast politically neutral. I mean, I roll my eyes every time I hear other people say it's not the party of blue, it's the party, or the party of red, it's the party of orange. It is true that Bitcoin is for everybody, but here in the United States in particular, one particular party is running on a pro-Bitcoin agenda, They've got some very big pro-Bitcoiners on their ticket, promising to make them cabinet members to let them have tremendous influence in their administration should they become the next president after Inauguration Day in 2021. And the other has the formal endorsement of Elizabeth Warren and her anti-crypto army. And in addition to her anti-Bitcoin, anti-crypto stances, also has other things that would be horrible for the Bitcoin community, like her unrealized capital gains proposal, or at least the continuation of the current capital gains scheme, which is, what's responsible for making it so hard to use Bitcoin from an accounting practice. If you want to at least not break any of the tax laws here in the United States, every single Bitcoin transaction you make is a reportable capital gains transaction. Things that just make it a little bit of a pain in the tuchus to use Bitcoin, at least to use it legally. They also have, it would also be a continuation of the previous 4 years, and therefore a continuation of Gary Gensler and his even if it's not a war on Bitcoin, because he hasn't really come down on Bitcoin, he's going after the low-hanging fruit. He's coming after the altcoins and the S coins. Whether you cheer that on or not, that's what you'd expect from an anti-Bitcoin chairman of the SEC, is to go after the low-hanging fruit first, to establish some precedents that he could then use to maybe crack down on Bitcoin in the future. Who knows whether he'll do that or not, but we do know he's been very unfriendly to Bitcoin businesses at the helm of the Operation Choke Point 2.0. War on banks being able to do business with Bitcoiners and Bitcoin businesses, not allowing making it prohibitively nightmarish for banks to custody Bitcoin, etc. So a vote for that party would be a vote for the continuation of the status quo in the United States. So for that reason, I've been very passionate about the election, even though I try and keep it to a minimum. But as Leggy points out in the boost, there's just one more week to go. It'll all be over, at least. Even if there's recounts or drama after the election, at least our ability to do anything about it in the terms of showing up and voting ends next Tuesday at 7 p.m. when the polls close. So as Leggy says, only one more week of this madness. So you won't have to listen to me rant and rave about it too much longer from an election standpoint, from a Team Red versus Team Blue standpoint. Of course, depending who wins, whether the pro-Bitcoin candidate wins and does or does not keep his campaign promises, or whether the anti-crypto candidate wins and continues their war on crypto, I'll still get uptight about politics from time to time. But I do apologize for those of you who are getting sick of listening to me ramble on about it. But take heart, as Leggy points out. Hopefully that's coming to an end in less than a week now, because we're coming to you a day late, and it was already less than a week on Wednesday, since Election Day is Tuesday. Speaking of Leggy and our listeners, our geographic distribution of listeners has remained unchanged this week. Our top 10 countries where our listeners reside is as follows. As has been the history of almost this entire podcast, and understandably, since this is a U.S. podcast and I do the podcast in English, it's not a U.S. podcast, as in it's for U.S. listeners. It's a U.S. podcast, as in I'm in the United States, sitting right here in really hot, humid Florida. I mean, I'm sweating right now doing this podcast. And yesterday when I left Albuquerque, New Mexico, it was only 40 degrees, which, it's not freezing, but it's freezing cold compared to being at the beach in paradise. So number one remains the United States, where more than half of you are listening. So thank you to all my fellow Americans. Hopefully you're showing up to vote on Tuesday, and hopefully you're showing up well informed on which candidate you agree with the most, but particularly as a Bitcoiner, which candidate is going to benefit your Bitcoin interests the most, and hopefully you act upon that. I think it's a no-brainer, especially if you've been listening to this podcast. You understand my opinion on that. Number two remains Argentina. Actually, I guess that's the same as last week when Argentina had climbed back into the number two spot. So muchas gracias, amigos. Buenos dias. I guess it's still bright, sunny afternoon here in Florida. So thank you to those of you listening in Argentina. Number three remains Germany. So guten Tag, Dankeschön, mein friends in Deutschland. Number four remains Canada. I've seen more and more reports about Canada transforming itself back into the frozen white north. So thank you to those of you who are definitely not sitting there sweating in a hot tropical environment while you're listening to this podcast. Unless, of course, you're snowbirds and you found your way down to here to places such as Florida. But either way, thank you to those of you listening in Canada, regardless of whether you're getting ready to pack up and move to a warmer climate for the winter, or whether you're going to tough it out and maybe heat your home with the heat coming off of a Antminer S9 or some other mining rig. Number four Okay, number 5 remains Luxembourg. So Morian, to those of you who speak Luxembourgish, Guten Tag, Danke schön, for those of you who speak German listening in Luxembourg. Number 6 remains the United Kingdom. So thank you to our cousins across the pond in the United Kingdom, where it's certainly not afternoon, but hopefully the weather isn't as frigid as it is in Canada. The United Kingdom obviously is cooler than the United States in general, temperature-wise. Don't let that go to your head. You Brits listen to this podcast. But thank you for those of you who are. Number 7 remains Singapore. So thank you to those of you listening in Singapore, or apa kabar, as I've been told is an appropriate greeting for those of you in Singapore. Nobody has reached out to me to tell me I'm wrong. So if I am wrong, I do apologize. DM me on Twitter at BTC Bulletin Pod and let me know if apa kabar is appropriate, or if there's a different saying that I should be greeting you with. Number 6 remains Spain. So muchos gracias, amigos, in Spain. Number 9 remains Colombia. So muchos gracias, amigos, in Colombia. And of course, number 10 remains Mexico. Again, muchas gracias, amigos, in Mexico. It's really flattering that we have so many Spanish language listeners, even though my Spanish is really, really awful. So anytime I butcher an attempt at speaking Spanish, I do apologize. I never took Spanish formally. I just picked up a little bit of it here and there, growing up in Arizona and New Mexico and traveling around out west. It's kind of a increasing necessity to at least speak a little bit of Spanish. But now that I live here in Florida, not as much so. And of course, a lot of the Spanish-speaking individuals I run into out in Florida have a different dialect of Spanish. Funny side note, when I lived in Arizona before I moved out here, one of my friends was going to be certified by the courts in Phoenix to be a Spanish translator. And he grew up in a Spanish-speaking household. His father didn't even speak English, but they had immigrated from Spain, where his father had been a shepherd in Spain. So his father was humble, but a hard worker, but never learned English nonetheless. And Santiago grew up speaking both English and Spanish. And when he went to take his Spanish translator test, he failed. They wouldn't certify him for Spanish translation. And that is because, believe it or not, there is a significant difference between the Spanish that people speak in Spain and the Spanish that people speak in Mexico or other Latin American countries, at least enough that it made a difference for the court interpretation policy. I always got a kick out of that because, English, King's English in England and English in the United States definitely have their differences, different accents, quirky things like bonnet or boot, versus trunk, or buggy versus shopping basket. But when I run into somebody from England, I can certainly understand what they're saying, even if they do have an accent, or if I have an accent in their ears. Either way, real quick, I want to say thank you to everybody listening to this podcast, regardless of where you're at, because this is truly an international podcast. Scrolling through the statistics, literally any country I can think of is on that list, even if it's in very, very small percentiles of listenership. And that is just really cool because Bitcoin is for everybody, everywhere in the world, regardless of who you are and where you're at. It's flattering that our audience reflects that. So once again, thank you to all of you listening to the podcast today. And on to the news. As is usually the case, whenever I do this podcast anyway, it seems that the Bitcoin's price is what a lot of people are focused on. As they say, the price is the news and the news is the price. Speaking of which, we came within a whisker of setting a new all-time high the other day. Depending on where you get your data, we came within $200 of setting a new all-time high. Of course, we're already in all-time high territory if you consider the all-time high, the cycle bull run all-time high, where we topped out at about 69,000 US dollars. We set a new all-time high before the halving when the spot Bitcoin ETFs came out. That is obviously Bitcoin's all-time high, but it's kind of a golden swan thing. That's an all-time high that I don't think we would have set had it not been for the ETF pump. I've spoken about that at length. So along the lines, and speaking of the ETFs, as the price is pumping, or maybe because the price is pumping, or maybe price pump because, depends what kind of correlation or causation you want to attribute to this. The ETFs saw literally billions of dollars in inflows into those ETFs in the last few days. I don't have today's numbers yet. They come out, the markets have only been closed for like an hour. and the numbers normally come out later in the evening, so I won't have those numbers before I finish recording, but a tremendous amount of US dollars has flown into the spot Bitcoin ETFs, allowing them to soak up more than $1 billion worth of Bitcoin, including almost $1 billion just on BlackRock alone. I think there were $850 million in inflows just on Monday or Tuesday alone into BlackRock's spot Bitcoin ETF. And that is insane. And that's why I keep saying, please do not sell your Bitcoin to BlackRock. Every Satoshi that gets sucked into these Wall Street funds, that get sucked into the ETFs or other Wall Street funds, are Satoshis that plebs like you and I will no longer be able to use as peer-to-peer electronic cash, something that goes against Satoshi's initial vision. Obviously, it's good for price in the short run, but it's kind of selling Bitcoin's soul in the long run. So currently, the price of Bitcoin has pulled back a bit. We are still easily in striking distance of a new all-time high. Just like the fire engine I hear roaring behind the studio is within striking distance of running into this podcast. So if that's bleeding through my noise canceling, I apologize. Hopefully it'll be out of the way in a bit, because it sounds like it's not turning onto this street. And of course, as I mentioned, we are obviously above the post-halving bull run all-time high in November 2021 of 69,000. Speaking of price, Alex Stanzik tweeted a headline from Bitcoin Magazine yesterday saying, just in, Reddit sold the majority of its Bitcoin before Bitcoin started pumping in October, according to an SEC filing. Of course, the meme with the meme where it's got the lion and the stone carvings and a couple other people making that ooh face. And yeah, that's certainly got a sting, but it wouldn't be the first bad decision Reddit's made. So ouch. But again, that gets back to, I want you to hold Bitcoin. So, not the big businesses, not the Wall Street funds, etc. So if Reddit misses out because they sold their Bitcoin, but that allows another pleb to stack those Satoshis, especially at a discount compared to what it's trading at now, that's a good thing, in my humble opinion. Of course, taking the exact opposite approach, CoinDesk reported yesterday, a headline, quote, Michael Saylor's MicroStrategy plans to raise $42 billion to buy more Bitcoin over the next 3 years. The company reported its third quarter earnings result after the close of trading on Wednesday afternoon. The article goes on. Self-described Bitcoin development company MicroStrategy did not add to its Bitcoin holdings since mid-September, but the firm announced an audacious plan to raise $42 billion of capital over the next 3 years in order to purchase more of the world's largest crypto. Led by Executive Chairman Michael Saylor, the company's so-called 21-21 plan calls for $21 billion of equity raises and $21 billion of debt offerings over the next 3 years. Quote, as a Bitcoin treasury company, we plan to use the additional capital to buy more Bitcoin as a treasury reserve asset in a manner that will allow us to achieve higher BTC yield, said Phong Li, president and CEO, in the third quarter earnings release. MicroStrategy's most recent previous disclosure was in mid-September when it announced the purchase of 7,420 Bitcoin for $458.2 million. That brought its holdings to the point that brought its Bitcoin holdings to that point to 252,220 Bitcoins, acquired for a total of $9.9 billion, or an average price of $39,266 each. At the current price of about $72,000, the company's Bitcoin is worth more than $18 billion. As the end of the quarter, it says as, it's probably a typo, as probably means at the end of the quarter, the company had $891.3 million of dry powder remaining from a previous capital raise. So Michael Saylor, as controversial as he was last week with his comments about self-custody, depending on how you interpret that, is also still remains the Bitcoin Giga Chad in social media realms at least. And MicroStrategy and Michael Saylor both continue to try and gobble up every Bitcoin they can. Obviously, not even a fraction. Well, it's a fraction, but not even close to the almost $26 billion that BlackRock alone has. Even more amongst the other Bitcoin spot ETFs, but certainly a massive player. And even though most people, I think, are still Michael Saylor fans, and most people are still fans of MicroStrategy's accumulation strategy, those are still Bitcoin that have the same that have this that it's the same as the Bitcoin that gets sucked up by other Wall Street entities such as the spot ETFs. That's Bitcoin that will no longer be accessible for plebs to stack or plebs to use, as Bitcoin was intended by Satoshi as a peer-to-peer electronic currency. So, take that with a grain of salt. I know it's good for pumping the bags. I know it's good for number go up, but I would rather see you stacking those Satoshis than Michael Saylor or MicroStrategy, and certainly the spot Bitcoin ETFs. At least MicroStrategy and Michael Saylor currently, as we know them, are friends of Bitcoin, whereas Wall Street in general is not. They're just trying to profit off Bitcoin. And I guess Michael Saylor is just trying to profit off Bitcoin as well, but at least he's doing so in the terms of he's trying to preserve his capital. As he described his pile of cash that MicroStrategy was sitting on as that melting ice cube, and he was trying to keep inflation from nibbling away at their stack of cash. But you get the point. Either way, MicroStrategy and Michael Saylor intend to gobble up at least $42 billion more worth of Bitcoin over the next 3 years. So the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? Of course, today is also Bitcoin White Paper Day, as I talked about in the first portion of today's podcast, the intro to today's podcast. It is both the 16th anniversary of the Bitcoin White Paper and Halloween. As I mentioned, millions of children will be dressing up as their favorite character today, and it seems ironic or perhaps apropos that on the day when millions and millions of children will be pretending to be something they are not, we have the emergence of a new scammer pretending to be Satoshi Nakamoto. Yes, just months after a British court decisively ruled that CSW is not Satoshi, we now have FakeToshi 2.0. This morning, ironically also in London, Stefan Molla held a press conference where he claimed that he is Satoshi. Of course, this is apparently not the first time Molla has raised his ugly head and made this claim that he is the inventor of Bitcoin. This press conference today, though, was covered by, among other people, BBC and their crypto reporter, Joe Tidy. Joe tweeted a number of observations during the press conference, including getting up and leaving halfway through the conference, but also revealing the fact that Molla attempted to charge reporters £500 just to attend. Clearly the selfless Satoshi Nakamoto, the richest man in the world, not the sort of thing you'd expect from Satoshi, the person who gifted us Bitcoin and then disappeared, not benefiting at all from his creation or their creation, depending whether you believe it's one person or a group of people. But you have this so-called Satoshi, who would be the richest man in the world, wanting £500 apiece for the handful of reporters that attended. Not very much money in the grand scheme of things if you have a million Bitcoin to your name. Now there's a dog barking incessantly, and this dog is freaking annoying. The people that live next to the studio, they let this dog out at 6 o'clock in the morning, and then they just let it freaking bark until it's time for them to go to work, and then they let their dog back in. These are the most poorly behaved dogs I've ever met. They try and dig under the fence all the time, and they just yowl every time they're outside, and not a peep from the owners. Not once do they stick their head outside and say, hush to the dogs. They just let them bark. They don't give a frip. I'm assuming they have either really, really soundproof windows, or their children are so loud that they just don't notice in comparison. But I apologize if this dog doesn't shut up soon and if it's bleeding through the podcast. There's been one interruption after another today. I'm also not recording at my normal time, so normally I try and record late at night for a variety of reasons. The loud trucks and stuff going up and down the highway don't bleed through the soundproofing. They normally bleed through the soundproofing. The studio aren't there. Barking dogs, loud motorcycles ripping up and down the highway, construction. Like there's a big Westin resort going in Cocoa Beach now, and for more than a month now, they've been pounding these probably 50-foot concrete beams into the sand to stabilize what will be the foundation. And they start at about 7:30 in the morning, and they go until about 5 in the afternoon. And there is no place in the relatively small barrier island that is Cocoa Beach to get away from where you can't hear it, because it's a low thud. That sort of noise carries long distances, and it's traveling through the ground because they're pounding these 5 stories underground. So the ground transmits that sound everywhere you're at. And I waited till they stopped the day before I started recording, but it's still way, way earlier than normal. Another tangent. Anyway, Joe Tidy tweeted from this quote unquote event in London. Tweeting first, I'm at a London event billed as the unveiling of the true legal identity of Bitcoin inventor Satoshi Nakamoto. An odd setup to the press conference, as the organizer asked me to pay £500 to attend and appear on stage to ask questions of the billionaire mystery man. Then about an hour later, he tweeted, Mr. Mullah is showing a series of easy to fake screenshots. I asked if he will move some of the Genesis Bitcoins to finally prove he is Satoshi. He said he will in the next few months. I have left the conference. Joe Tidy bills himself as crypto correspondent at BBC News. He's had his Twitter account since September of 2008, and it lists him as an expert in cybersecurity, online safety, crypto, AI, social networks, and global news. So it goes to show that that this press conference was laughable in more way than one. But what do you expect from someone who's a scammer? Speaking of scammer, it is important to note that Mullah has been in trouble with the law in the past. I believe in October 2024, he faced fraud charges related to his previous claims of being Satoshi Nakamoto. I guess he was privately, it says it was a private, looking up on the internet, it says there was a private prosecution alleging crypto fraud, accusing Mullah pretending to be the Bitcoin inventor while falsely claiming to own 165,000 Bitcoin in Singapore. So, that's only a month ago, but apparently it was before this press conference, and he is accused of fraud in Singapore in relation to these claims. Of course, at today's press conference, he showed laughable evidence, at least as laughable, maybe even more kindergarten, more juvenile, more laughable than what CSW showed in the legal proceedings in the COPA versus CSW trial, where he got the smackdown from the judge and the court ordering him to no longer claim to be CSW, and no longer claiming to be Satoshi, or having ownership or copyright over the Bitcoin code or the Bitcoin white paper. That's enough of that, because the only reason I mentioned it is because late last night, when the news was breaking that there was going to be this press conference, it was big news for several hours anyway. Also in the news, Jamie Dimon appears to be coming out swinging against securities and banking regulators here in the United States. Not necessarily pro-Bitcoin, but interesting headline nonetheless, with Yahoo Finance reporting the headline, Jamie Dimon slams U.S. regulators. It's time to fight back. Of course, Jamie Dimon being no fan of Bitcoin. The article says JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon didn't discuss U.S. election candidates during a public appearance Monday, but he had plenty to say about his current regulators in Washington, D.C. Side note, as I mentioned, the current administration, if the current establishment candidate wins, we'd expect to see the same regulators and the same regulations and the same general direction as far as the government's relationship with Bitcoin and banking, et cetera, goes. So that's the tie into Bitcoin here. Back to the article. The boss of the biggest bank in the U.S. called a raft of regulatory proposals from his overseers, quote, an onslaught, criticized Consumer Financial Protection Bureau Director Rohit Chopra, and made it clear the industry is willing to push back on new rules in court. Quote, it's time to fight back, Dimon said while speaking at an American Bankers Association convention in New York City. Quote, I've had it with this shit. His quote, not mine. Beep. Continuing the quote, we don't want to get involved in litigation just to make a point, he added, but I think if you're in a knife fight, you'd better damn well bring a knife. So Jamie Dimon, not a stranger to inflammatory comments recently, but certainly showing that he's getting sick of the current administration, sick of the direction the U.S. government and regulators are currently trending, something that I know all of us Bitcoiners are as well. Finally, the article wraps up saying the comments offered the latest example of how the biggest banks in the U.S. are getting bolder about confronting their overseers. All right, on to what makes today, or at least yesterday, and every Wednesday special, and that's because yesterday was DCA Wednesday. What is DCA, you ask? Well, DCA is short for dollar cost averaging, and dollar cost averaging is an investment strategy where you invest your money in equal portions at regular intervals regardless of price. Yesterday was our 171st stack. We started stacking $20. That was our equal portion of Bitcoin every Wednesday. So weekly was our regular interval, regardless of price, all the way back on July 28th of 2021. In that time, we converted a total of $3,400 US, $20 at a time, into a stack of 10,058,519 sats. And even though we bought all the way up to the 2021 all-time high and all the way down to the bear market low, and then all the way up to the new all-time high this spring, and then kind of through the crab market, and now We stacked at what was going to be almost the all-time high again. Our average cost basis was still just $33,802.19, which is not only significantly cheaper than the current US dollar value of Bitcoin, but it's also cheaper than the $39,000 we would have purchased Bitcoin at had we YOLO'd in more than 3 years ago and made one big lump sum purchase. There are a couple episodes where I get into the results of our DCAing over specific periods of time in depth. But either way, I think we've shown the power of DCA and the power of stacking even just 20 US dollars. 20 US dollars is not a lot of Bitcoin for a lot of you listening. It would seem almost frivolous to stack that little amount of Bitcoin for some of you, but for others listening, that may be more money than you have in your wallet right now. That might be more than you have to stack. But again, I picked that number because I wanted to show that even if you can come up with only the equivalent of 20 US dollars, that over time, you'd end up with an appreciable stack of Satoshis. And at a tenth of a Bitcoin, more than 0.1 Bitcoin, I think we've clearly proved that in abundance. Yesterday, we stacked at a slightly higher price than we are currently sitting at. We stacked at a price of $72,415 US dollars. That got us an additional 26,997 sats. So it brought our new total up to 10,085,516 Satoshis. It also increased our average cost basis by a little more than $100, by $100, $107.83 to be exact. So our new average purchase price is $33,910.02. If Bitcoin stays where it's at, if the price doesn't drop dramatically, that means next DCA Wednesday, it's finally going to have bumped our average cost basis above $34,000, but still less than half of Bitcoin's current value. Of course, that stack of more than 10 million sats is, at the current price, it has a US dollar value of $7,303.42, which is certainly, a lot more than the $3,420 that we've now converted, more than double that, in fact. But when the bull market finally gets underway, and, I still think the price is higher than it should be at this point. If it hadn't been for the Golden Swan event of the spot Bitcoin ETFs, I'd say we're right on track because Bitcoin usually eclipses its previous cycle all-time high 6 months to a year after the halving. And we're getting in that range. But in general, if you look at the big picture, I would have expected to retake 69,000 about a month from now, maybe a little longer from now, between Thanksgiving and Christmas. So November of December of this year. Had we not had that Golden Swan and we were where we are now, I'd say, yeah, that's right in line with that 6 months to a year from the halving. But I still think we're benefiting price-wise from that Golden Swan ETF pump, all of which will be moot when this base melting bull run really gets underway and we hit the cycle's ultimate all-time high, whether that's 100,000, 200,000, 500,000. There's even people saying that we're going to hit 1 million. There's people saying we're going to hit 3 million in this cycle. Nobody has a crystal ball. We're not going to know until we're looking in the rearview mirror, when hindsight is always 2020. But for example, when Bitcoin hits 100,000 US dollars for the first time, and I think it's reasonable to say that's going to happen this cycle. I think it'll probably happen by the end of this year, maybe not till the beginning of 2025. It could happen as soon as Tuesday if it looks like a pro-Bitcoin candidate gets elected, because just as the polls have been reflecting Donald Trump's favor, making it look like that Donald Trump is probably going to win the election, Polymarket, the betting markets, have him winning by like 68% to 32%. And that news pumped all markets across the board. Wall Street set all-time record highs. Gold is at all-time record high. Of course, Bitcoin pumped to within $200 of its all-time record high. Even the altcoins are pumping on Bitcoin's coattails. So just the rumor, the thought that maybe he's going to win, pumped Bitcoin. So I would think it'd be reasonable to believe that if he wins on election night next Tuesday, that all the markets are going to rally because he's the more business friendly and clearly the more Bitcoin friendly of the two candidates. Pledging to free Ross Ulbricht, pledging to end capital gains tax on Bitcoin transactions. He doesn't even really have to do more than he did last term, because on Joe Biden's first day in office, he issued like 100 executive orders, just repealing everything Donald Trump did. And all Donald Trump has to do is restore the executive orders that he had in place 4 years ago. A no-brainer. It's just signing a piece of paper. And I think we see the economy and markets, including Bitcoin, rally. But again, the crystal ball thing, it could also be one of those buy the rumors, sell the news things, and we could see Bitcoin tank. Doesn't matter. Bitcoin does crazy things. Bitcoin does what it's going to do. Again, if you zoom out, though, Bitcoin continues on its up and to the right. And I firmly believe that 4 years of Vivek Ramaswamy as an advisor to President Trump, of RFK Jr. in Trump's cabinet, of Elon Musk as an advisor to Donald Trump, I think is going to be pro-Bitcoin, even though Bitcoin doesn't need Donald Trump to be a success. Either way, when Bitcoin hits that $100,000 mark, our current stack would have a US dollar value of $10,085.51. When Bitcoin hits $1 million, whether it does it by the end of the year like Samson Mao says it will do, or whether it does it next cycle or in the 2030s, either way, without adding a single Satoshi to this stack, our current stack would have a value of $100,855.16, an insane return on just 3,420 US dollars. Of course, if Bitcoin hits Fidelity's target, what Fidelity said by 2038, they believe that Bitcoin will hit 1 billion. At least Fidelity's director of global macro Jurian Timmer, said that he believes Bitcoin would be worth $1 billion by 2038. If that ever happens, the current stack of Satoshis we have without adding another sat would be worth a whopping 100,855,160, firmly putting you in the world's financial elite with just the Satoshis that we've stacked $20 a week for the last little over 3 years. All right, that is all I have to talk about today. I promised I would keep this script short and sweet. Didn't keep it quite as short and sweet as I thought I would. But before I go, I want to ask those of you listening to help support the podcast, not necessarily through the Podcasting 2.0 method where you can send a shout out, a boost like Leggy did, or stream us Satoshis as you listen, but by feeding that algorithm monster. It's really super easy for you to do so just by doing simple things like making sure you're following the podcast's Twitter or X at BTC Bulletin Pod. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, and a significant portion of you are, most of you, the majority, are actually listening on Podcasting 2.0 apps, according to the stats I looked at this afternoon. But for those of you still listening on Apple Podcasts, remember, Apple Podcast about a year ago now started disabling automatic downloads for those of you who weren't listening to at least 2 episodes a week of a specific podcast. We only do 1 episode a week, so that clearly put us in the unsubscribe or automatic disable of automatic downloads that Apple Podcasts was doing. So if you would double check and make sure you still are subscribed and you still have automatic downloads enabled, that helps feed that algorithm monster. Of course, rating and reviewing the podcast helps tremendously in boosting the podcast in the algorithm rate, in the rankings, as far as the algorithms determine whether or not they're going to display this podcast as a result when people are searching for podcasts. So that varies. That's different to do based on what platform you're listening on, but it's a relatively simple podcast. Obviously, I would appreciate and adore a 5-star rating, but be honest, be fair. Any rating helps boost, helps feed that algorithm monster. But also, I love hearing from my listeners. I love it when I get boosts because it's really cool that to know that you value the value I'm giving you. You value your time listening to this podcast and my time in recording it enough to send some Satoshis. But perhaps more importantly, I like hearing from you. I like the little snippets of a message, just saying hi, maybe where you're at or what you're thinking or what you think about the podcast. It really makes doing this podcast worth it to just to hear that we're appreciated. And that doesn't mean appreciated monetarily with dollars or sats. That just means I know people are out there listening, and I can see that in the stats. I know what countries people are listening from and in what numbers. And that is really, really flattering, but nothing has that personal touch like reaching out and saying hi. And it's easy to do. You can do it for free on Twitter. You can send me a DM. And again, our Twitter or on X, we're at BTC Bulletin Pod. I check my DMs. I actually respond to my DMs. I mean, we get DMs that are the cute Asian girl. Hi, how is your trading going? And I don't respond to those, but if it's a legit DM, I check Twitter all the time and I respond. A lot of people out there listening. I know it's hard to believe that boomers and Gen Xers listen to Bitcoin podcasts, but they're out there in large numbers. I'm not looking at the stats right now, but I think it's pushing 50% of our podcast is 40 or older of our podcast audience. So the older you get, the less likely you are to be on social media. If that's you, you can send me a good old-fashioned email. The email for this podcast is bitcoinbulletin@protonmail.com. Not a sponsor of the show, but I love Proton Mail. It's fully end-to-end encrypted, as I think all emails should be, and it's a free service. So again, that's Bitcoin Bulletin at protonmail.com. I have that email open on the screen in front of me right now. I do read that email regularly, and I also reply to all of our emails. So real quick, again, thank you to all of you listening, regardless of where you're listening from tonight. Before I wrap it up, I want to remind you there are a couple other ways you can support this podcast, simply just scrolling through the show notes. There are no sponsors of the podcast. I mentioned that I use Cash App every podcast to do our stack. Again, not a sponsor, but since I'm a user of Cash App and a user of Fold and a user of Strike, every service you use nowadays, it seems like, gives you a referral code where if you refer friends or family, they get something for free for signing up. And there's a slew of those referral codes in the show notes. So if you, whatever podcast app you're listening to, if you scroll down past the show notes at the very bottom, there are some referral codes. And if there's a service there that you like and you're considering signing up for, click on the referral code. If not for me, if for somebody, because you're giving away free sats or free US dollars, depending what the offer is, by just signing up without a referral code. You know, even if you're buying something like a cold card, I don't have a referral code for CoinKite or any of those stores, but you know, I bought a new cold card the other day and I used a different podcast referral code because you're overpaying if you don't. Anyway, I'm rambling. The important thing is that you join us next Wednesday and every Wednesday as we continue to grow our stack of Satoshis together, just $20 US at a time. But the thing that's the most important, whether you listen or not, is just keep on stacking those sats, you sexy sat stackers.